sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hello, everybody. This is the Avram Davidson Universe podcast. This is actually part 2 of an interview with Josh Pachter. We did an earlier story last month, and just a little bit about Josh. His first short story was written when he was 16 years old. It appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in 1968. Since then, he has published more than 100 crime stories in magazines and anthologies in the US and around the world. In 2020, the Two Body Problem won the Derringer in the Best Flash Story category, and Josh was awarded the Edgar D. Hoch Memorial Golden Derringer for Lifetime Achievement, making him the first person to receive that award and win a competitive Derringer in the same year. Today, we are going to be listening to and discussing The Last Wizard, which interestingly was originally published in the Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine in December of 1972, but then again published in F&SF in October of 1973. And Josh will be on momentarily. Josh, thanks so much for joining me for part 2.
I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, so I think a good starting place for this, or a good first question is, Avram was known probably more in the science fiction world, but I'd love to know where you think he fits in within the mystery world.
Well, Avram was an unusual writer in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that he was an unusual writer was that he had a range that I think most people in most genres don't really have. He could write a fairly straightforward crime fiction story in the same way that he could write a fairly straightforward science fiction story or a fairly straightforward fantasy story. He did that, but he could also write these off-the-wall stories, like the one we talked about last episode, like the one we're going to talk about in this episode. Both of them really kind of out there stories. And to me, that makes him especially interesting. The fact that he wasn't, you couldn't typecast him.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly, Seth, I don't remember if we said this in the last episode or if you and I, when we talked before the episode, if I said this, but one of the things that I always loved about Avram's work is that you just absolutely had no idea what you were going to get. When I opened up an issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, saw his name in the table of contents, my first reaction was, oh, goody, because I knew that whatever it was going to be something that was going to be very, very well worth my time, my reading time. But I look, put it this way: if you read a Sherlock Holmes story, you have a very good idea what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get Sherlock, you're going to get Dr. Watson, you're going to get a apparently unresolvable mystery that the great detective finds a way to resolve. You're going to get all those buttons are going to get pushed. There was a crime fiction writer some years ago, long dead now, named Ronald Knox.
Mm-hmm.
And Ronald Knox put out rules for crime fiction. And I think they were probably about 60% tongue-in-cheek, maybe more than 60% tongue-in-cheek. But over the decades since he published this article, people have taken them fairly seriously. Like, one of the rules is that no crime story can have more than one secret passage. One of the rules was no nefarious Chinaman. And in fact, just recently, Criminal Andrew, one of the great publishers of short crime fiction, did a book within the last couple of months that's called The School of Hard Knocks, Knox, for Ronald Knox, where they went to a dozen writers and they asked each of them to write a story that broke one of Knox's rules.
Mm.
And Avram just broke all the rules.
Yeah.
He brought an anarchy to the pages of Ellery Queen's mystery magazine that otherwise wasn't there, except in later years in the stories of a guy named James Powell, who did a very similar kind of a thing where he would just kind of break those rules and do whatever he felt like doing. But I think that's to me really the importance of Powell and also of Avram, or one of the importances. I mean, the key importance is that they both wrote terrific fiction, but another importance is that they showed that the only real rule is that there are no rules.
Makes sense. Talk a little bit about, I'd love to get a two-part question here. I do fairly often get some young writers who love listening to the podcast and love learning more about Avram. Any advice you'd give to young writers, and also maybe tying that into how your career has progressed?
Well, I don't think anybody's ever done a better job of giving advice to writers than Robert A. Heinlein,
Mm-hmm.
whose 5 rules for writers begin with number 1: you must write. I've talked with plenty of people over the years who talk about how they wish they were writing. And if they took the amount of time they spent talking about how they wish they were writing to sit down and actually bang on a keyboard, they'd be writing. So, Heinlein says you must write. He says you must finish what you write. And I can't even begin to imagine how many unfinished, wonderful novels and short stories and poems and memoirs and books of nonfiction are sitting on people's hard drives or in their desk drawers because they never got finished. And then Heinlein says you must take what you have written and put it in the hands of somebody who is prepared to pay you for having written it. And that can be a tough thing for wannabe writers to do, because the moment you put your work out there into the hands of a gatekeeper, what you're doing is you're inviting rejection, and rejection is hard to swallow. But if you're not prepared to be rejected, then maybe you should just get a diary and write in your diary. And then Heinlein's 4th rule is that once you have put something out into the marketplace, if it's rejected, but you still have faith in it, you need to put it back out again, because the thing that one editor rejects might be the exact same thing that another editor is eager to purchase. I'm fortunate enough at this point that most of what I write, I'm able to sell to the first editor I send it to. But if the first editor rejects it, I'm going to send it to the second, and if necessary, the third and the fourth. And eventually, if I'm confident that it's a worthwhile piece of work, eventually I'll find the editor who's prepared to purchase it. And then Heinlein's 5th rule is the one that I'm not sure I agree with. In fact, I'm pretty sure I don't agree with it. His 5th rule was that you should never rewrite except when an editor asks you to.
Mm.
And I don't agree with that, because I know that I'm a different human being today than the human being I was 10 years ago, 1 year ago, last week. And so if I was going to today write a story that I actually wrote a year ago, I would write it differently today. Well, if I'm going to put it out into the marketplace today, I want it to be the story that I would write today. And so when I have a story that gets rejected, I don't just automatically just fling it out into the world again. I look at it and I tinker with it and I toy with it and hopefully make it better. And when I have made it better enough, somebody's going to buy it. Now, having said all that, 2 pieces of advice from me, one generic, one very specific. The generic one is don't ever throw anything away.
Mm-hmm.
There was a period in my early writing career when I was, I don't know, teenager, 20s, when I was getting rejected a lot. And I never threw any of those stories away. I just kept them. And then in the middle 1980s, um, two fraternal twin sisters, Jackie Lewis and Jerry Winston, who were the sisters of Penthouse publisher Bob Guccione, and who published a string of magazines that made Penthouse look like highlights for children. They published just filthy porn magazines, but what they liked to read was spy fiction. And there wasn't a lot of spy fiction in the short form, so they decided they would start a non-pornographic magazine that focused on spy fiction. They called it Espionage. It lasted for a few years. Ultimately, didn't last longer than a few years. But while it was in business, I went back and I took these old stories that I had rejected, and not all of them, but quite a few of them, I rewrote as spy stories and was able to sell them to Jackie and Jerry. If I had thrown them away, that those sales would never have happened. And then the more specific tip is to go back to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. When I sold my first story to EQMM in 1968, it appeared in a special section of the magazine called the Department of First Stories, where the rule was that that department, that one slot in every issue of the magazine, was reserved for someone who had never before had a professional publication. And that department of the magazine continues to exist today, 55 years later, where the editor, current editor, Janet Hutchings, I don't know the real number, so I'm just going to say something. Where Janet, let's say, gets 100 submissions a week from professional writers, she might only get 3 or 4 a week from first timers. And so there's much less competition to get into the Department of First Stories than there is to get into the rest of the magazine. So anybody who's interested in writing, I would say, if you haven't had a professional publication, read a few issues of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine so you get a sense of Janet's taste. And then write a crime story and submit it electronically. And the subject line of your submission should be Department of First Stories. And I know that many of the great short crime fiction writers got their start that way.
Wow. It's funny. I talked to Frederick Stanay's son. It's Frederick,
Richard,
and who are the other? It's Frederick, and who are the brothers?
and Manny Lee.
Okay, so
Manfred Lee.
Yeah, so, or maybe it's Manford. So Rand Lee. I talked to Rand.
Yeah, Rand is Manny's son.
Yeah, so I talked to Rand, and he was telling me about an amazing letter that Avram had sent him. Rand was a big fan of Avram's and had sent out basically asked Avram for some advice because he had such great respect for his writing. And he wrote a letter back, and it was funny because he was giving some of Avram's rules and comparing the two rules, pretty similar, but the one different, definitely keep everything, that's for sure, which Avram did, which I had a lot of stuff to go through, but the other one difference was don't ever worry about finishing. It's okay if you start something and don't finish, which Avram was notorious for starting series, novels, stories, and not finishing them. But what he said is you may want to go back to it at some point. So if you feel like you write something and you're just not there, go to something else. And maybe you never come back to that.
I think that's the answer to that thing that people call writer's block.
Right.
People talk about writer's block as if what that means is that you cannot write. And that's not what it means. What writer's block means is that whatever it is you're working on, you cannot write that right now. So fine, set it aside and move on to something else and come back to it later.
Or don't want to. It just doesn't feel. And maybe you have a little bit more liberty when you've published a bunch already, so it's a little bit easier for you. But maybe it's this. I just don't like. I promised this novel, but I don't enjoy this anymore. I'm just going to move on to something else.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, this is the main reason that I don't write novels, except for the one that I showed you last time.
Yeah.
My one and only in 55 years, is that it takes too long for me. Now, I know that there are people like James Patterson who can crank out a book, or I don't know how many of them he's cranking out himself anymore. He's got co-writers who probably do the bulk of the writing. But you've got people who can crank out a book in 5 weeks or 4 weeks. And I admire that,
Yeah.
especially when the book that they crank out in 4 or 5 weeks is well plotted and well written, which some people can in fact do. But it's not me. I'm lazy. You know, if I had the choice between writing and not writing, I would mostly pick not writing. And, you know, sometimes what happens is I have an idea for a story and I sit down and write it. But the reason I'm saying this is because I'm not an eager writer. I don't sit down to write anything until I know that it's something I really want to write.
Hmm.
And if I want to write it, then I want to finish it. So I don't ever abandon a project unfinished. I might set it aside knowing I will come back to it later, but I never abandon anything. So, you know, Avram and I would disagree about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's if you looked at the amount of unfinished stories that he had, it would blow. I mean, he wrote somewhere close to 300, 400 short stories, right? But then when I look through his writings, there's another 100 or plus uncompleted, not completed stories. It's incredible.
Well, here's what you should do, Seth. You should pick 100 current writers and send each of them one of those incomplete stories and have us finish them. And then there's a book, there's like 5 books of collaborations between Avram Davidson and contemporary writers.
Yeah, no, I mean
That
that's an
that
amazing idea. I know Michael Swanwick, and they're mostly short stories, by the way. Michael Swanwick finished one of his Phoenix or Virgil stories and did an incredible job. So there is something to that. I've got so many things that are unpublished to work on right now that I haven't even touched the uncompleted works yet.
so
So,
there are finished stories that have never been published.
oh yeah,
Have
oh
you
yeah.
tried sending any of them to Janet
Oh yeah, no,
Hutchins and Ellery Queens?
yeah, oh yeah, no, we've got well, some of them are so I just published for Avram's 100, we just had published for Avram's 100th birthday, AD 100, which were 100. And this was, I can't believe I did this. This was insane of me. I don't know what I was thinking. 100 of Avram's either uncollected or unpublished stories. And about 20-ish were never published. And some of them were as well written as anything that he'd had published. So
I'm writing down AD 100. I don't have that book, but it's one I need to get.
oh well, I will send it to you. So
Cool.
yeah, 8100. Well, I mean, let's go. We go on for hours here. Let's talk a little bit about today's story, which is The Last Wizard, and tell me why you selected The Last Wizard.
Well, for the same reason that I selected the Trefoil Company. There were 2 times that Avram and I appeared in the same issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. The first time was his The Trefoil Company and my Sam Buried Caesar in August 1971. The second time was a little more than a year later, in December 1972, when his The Last Wizard appeared in the same issue as my The Tip Off. And so when you asked me to pick one or a couple of stories, that was my first thought, was let's go with the stories that were in issues of the magazine that had both one of his and one of mine. And I'm so pleased that it was those 2 stories, because those are 2 of the Davidson stories that I remember the most fondly. And not just because I had a story in the same issue of the magazine, but because they're just both absolutely marvelous off the wall, strange and wonderful stories.
Two things on The Last Wizard and that particular publication. The first, and I mentioned it earlier in the introduction, I thought it was very interesting that that was published in Ellery Queen's 1972, but it was published a year later in FNSF in 1973. So I thought that was fascinating. And then I know you mentioned, I'd just be curious, I think it'd be an interesting little conversation about the tip-off wasn't the original title of your story. And I think that would be an interesting discussion point before we get into the story.
Yeah, sure. Fred Dene, the editor of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, editor and founder of the magazine, was notorious for changing authors' titles. And it pissed everybody off because, you're going to put a title on your story. Well, it's your title that you're putting on your story. And you feel some ownership attached to that. In fact, I remember when I wrote my second story for Ellery Queens, there was a title that I knew was absolutely the right title for that story. But I also by then knew that Fred had this reputation for changing titles. So I actually submitted the story to him with a different title, assuming, first of all, that he would change the title, and second of all, that he was good enough to, on his own, come up with what I knew was the right title, which is exactly what happened. He bought the story and published it under the right title, but not the one I submitted it as. Anyway, so when I submitted the tip-off to Fred, I called it SOS. And I thought that that was absolutely the right title for that story, because I really like titles that operate on multiple levels. And for that story, the title SOS did that. It had two different relevances, and you would not realize the second one until you got to the very end of the story. And then you would go, OMG, I see why it's called that. But Fred felt that my title, SOS, gave away the ending of the story. I disagree, but he was in charge, and so he changed it. The editors who followed him after, in fact, Ellery Queen, it's really kind of bizarre that Ellery Queens has been around now for over 80 years. It started publishing in the early 1940s. And then all that time, in 80 years, it's only had 3 editors-in-chief. After Fred passed, Eleanor Sullivan took over for about a dozen years or so, and then she passed on. And Janet Hutchings took over and has been there now for more than 30 years. And Eleanor and Janet, neither one of them ever changed any of my titles, and I don't know if they ever changed anybody's titles. But Fred felt like that was something that he just, I guess, not only wanted to do, but he felt like it was something that he had to do a lot. Anyway, so yeah, that was my story. It was just reprinted last year, and when I was reprinted, I put the title SOS back on it, and nobody said, "Oh, well, you shouldn't have called it that because it gives away the end of the story." Fred was usually right, but I think that was one time maybe he might have been wrong.
Well, I say let's get into The Last Wizard.
Absolutely. What a marvelous story. And
I can't wait.
Yeah, let's go.
The Last Wizard. For the 100th time, Bill Gullis looked with despair at the paper and pencil in front of him. Then he gave a short nod, got up, left his little room, and went 2 houses up the street, up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Presently, the door opened, and high up on the face which looked out at him were a pair of very pale gray-green eyes, otherwise bloodshot and bulging. Bill Gullis said, "I want you teach me how to make spell. I pay you." The eyes blinked rapidly. The face retreated. The door opened wider. Bill Gullis entered, and the door closed. The man said, So, you know, eh? How did you know? I see you through window, Professor. Bilgalas said, all the time you read great big books. Professor. Yes, they call me that. None of them know. Only you have guessed. After all this time, I, the greatest of the adepts, the last of the wizards. And now, you shall be my adept. A tradition 4,361 years old would have died with me, but now it will not. Sit down. Take reed pen, papyrus, cuttlefish ink, spit 3 times in bottle. Laboriously, Bilgalas complied. The room was small, crowded, and contained many odd things, including smells. We will commence, of course, the professor said, with some simple spells. To turn an usurer into a green fungus. Dippa-dabba-ruthu-thu-thu. Right. Enlisthu. You have written? So, and to obtain the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Kane hane antimene fane kane crux. These 2 will do for now. Return tomorrow at the same hour. Go! Bilgalas left. Waiting beside his door was a man with a thick briefcase and a thin smile. Mr. Bilgalas, I am from the Friendly Finance Company, and in regard to the payment which you— Dippa-dabba-ruthu-thu-thu enlisthu, said Bilgalas. The man turned into a green fungus, which settled in a hall corner and was slowly eaten by the roaches. Bilgalas sat down at the table, looked at the paper and pencil, and gave a deep sigh. Too much time this take, he muttered. Why I no wash socks, clean toilet, make a big pot cheap beans with pig's tail for eat? No, he said determinedly, and once more bent over the paper and pencil. By and by there was a knock at his door. Answering it, he saw before him the most beautiful woman in the world. I followed you, she said. I don't know what's happening. Kane hane antimony, said Bilgalas. Fane kane crux. She sank to her knees and embraced his legs. I love you. I'll do anything you want. Bilgalas nodded. Wash socks, clean toilet, he said, and cook big pot cheap beans with pig's tail for eat. He heard domestic sounds begin as he seated himself at the table and slowly, gently beat his head. After a moment, he rose and left the house again. Up the street a small crowd was dispersing, and among the people he recognized his friend, Labana. Listen, Labana, he said. Labana peered at him through dirty, mended eyeglasses. You see excitement? He asked, eager to tell. I no see. Labana drew himself up and gestured. You know Professor live there. He just now go crazy, he said, rolling his eyes and dribbling and flapping his arms in vivid imitation. Call ambulance, but he drop down dead. Too bad, eh? Too bad. Bilgalas sighed. Read too much big book. Bilgalas cleared his throat, looking embarrassed. Listen, Labana, what you want? How long you in country? 30 year. You speak good English. Citizen. Bilgalas nodded. He drew a pencil and piece of paper from his pocket. Listen, Labana. Do me big help. How you make spell in English? Please send me your free offer. 1 F or 2?
That story just had me in giggles.
You know, my wife is one of my biggest supporters. She really encourages my writing. She would like me to write more than I do write. But the one thing that I do that annoys her is when I write a story and the entire story is basically a setup for a last line punchline. And although she doesn't like it, I keep doing it because I just think they're fun. And this is probably the classic example of that kind of fiction, where the only reason that story exists is to get to that final line. And, you know, sometimes the payoff isn't worth it. That would be what you call a shaggy dog story, where you get to the punchline and it just makes you go, oh, God. But in this case, it's just so sweet and perfect, and it just makes everything that happened before in the story, not that it's all that much because it's a very short story, but
Yep.
but it just ties it together so perfectly, like the rug tied the room together in The Big Lebowski.
So a couple of things that I'm curious about would be, so going back to our previous story, is this also a surprising story to be published in Ellery Queen,
Oh,
or does this?
I don't know what Fred was thinking. Because if the Trefoil Company, which we talked about last time, is not at all a crime story, and it isn't,
Right.
The Last Wizard is even less a crime story. I suppose, it's a fantasy story.
Which
because
interests.
there is a wizard in it. It's not Bill Gulas. Although, actually, as it turns out, at the end of the story, yes, it is Bill Gulas. Bill Gulas has now become a wizard, almost against his will, certainly against his desire. He's looking, obviously, for not that kind of spell. But yeah, it's a fantasy story. It's not a mystery story. It's not a crime story. And all I can imagine, as with the Trefoil Company, is that Fred read it and laughed and said, you know what? It's my fucking magazine. I can do what I want. And so he put it in there. And I'm so glad he did. I'm especially glad that he put it in an issue that I was in, because that means I have a copy of it. So I can go back and look whenever I want.
I mean, there is a crime. He does turn one person into green fungus.
Well, I mean,
so I mean, can you explain the ending? Explain the punchline.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, it doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself. At the very beginning of the story, I think in the third paragraph of the story, I have it in front of me here. Bill Gulas said, "I want you to teach me how to make spell. I pay you."
Yeah.
That wonderful Russian accent.
Yeah.
And of course, especially because the story is called The Last Wizard, of course, you think that what Bill Gulas is asking is, how do I cast a magical spell? And the professor is so thrilled because he knows he's nearing the end of his life and he's got nobody to hand his esoteric knowledge off to. And here is a disciple for him. And so, yes, he teaches Bill Gulas how to make spell and turn, somebody into green fungus and make the most beautiful woman in the world your slave. Now, the one thing that doesn't make sense to me in this story, though, is that having taught Bill Gulas those two spells, the professor then kills himself, as if he doesn't have any other knowledge to impart. To me, if I stop and I think about it, I think okay, that's just a writer writing. That's not a story actually happening. If this was real, I think the professor probably would have stuck around long enough to teach Bill Goulis a whole lot more. But then you
Right.
get to the very end of the story, and Bill Goulis has circled around to where he started, and he goes to what's his name, Labana. He
Oh,
goes
yeah,
to
the bond.
Labana and says, "I want you to help me make spell. I need big help. How you make spell in English? Please send me your free offer, 1F or 2." And at that moment, that last line, you realize, oh my goodness, he never had any interest in learning how to cast a magical spell. The poor immigrant is just trying to send away for like a free coupon or something. And and so the professor's esoteric knowledge dies with him, and Bill Goulis probably is never going to say either of those two sentences again. Scotty Waddy Doodah, whatever it was, because he doesn't want to turn people into green slime. And he's already now got the most beautiful woman in the world. He's good now. He'll live happily ever after. With his free coupon once Blana helps him to spell offer.
Oh my
But it's
God.
just it's the ultimate shaggy dog story with a punchline that's actually funny rather
Yeah,
than dopey.
exactly. Um, Going back to my silly thing that I like to do, how would you adapt this story? And it's any thoughts?
Yeah, this one would be a tough adaptation, I think,
Mhm.
because it's so short.
Yep.
You couldn't really do it for TV because TV, it's got to be half an hour long, and
Yep.
in order to take this and turn it into a half an hour of television, I think that you just have to pad it in ways that would dilute the effectiveness of that final line. Now, I mean, what you could do with it is, if I was going to adapt it, what I would want to do is I would want to turn it into animation.
Hmm.
I'd want it to be a cartoon. I don't know if you've ever seen Mel Brooks's first film.
No. Which one
It's
is it?
actually it was called The Critic,
Okay.
and it's about a 4 minute long cartoon. And what it is it's abstract geometric shapes moving around on the screen, kind of what the British filmmaker Len Lye was doing in the 1930s. Uh, and then there's little music that's playing as these shapes dance around the screen. And I actually, when I was teaching for 50 years, what I taught was film appreciation. So I have a lot of movie references. And I would show this Mel Brooks film to my class 3 times. The first time I would show it, dead silence, no soundtrack. And I would tell them, raise your hand when you get bored. And it would usually take 25 seconds. And then the hands would start going up because it's just shapes dancing around on the screen. And then I would show it again. And the second time I would accompany it with some jazz music or some kind of music, instrumental music. And same thing now, even though they'd already seen it once and gotten bored by it, they were usually willing to put up with it for about 45 seconds with music attached to it. So the music made it more interesting. And then the third time I showed it with Mel Brooks's original soundtrack. And the original soundtrack is Mel Brooks himself bitching and moaning about this movie that you're looking at as an old man. Like Mel Brooks did the 2,000-year-old man. He was like the 2,000-year-old man in a movie theater going, "What's this? Shapes on this screen. What, did I pay $2 for shapes on the screen? Oi!" And it's hilariously funny. And no hands would ever go up because they were happy to watch and listen to the whole thing. And I can see The Last Wizard as sort of a in that spirit, an animated cartoon because of the Bill Goulis character. He was such a
Yeah.
funny character. I could just see him going to the professor in animated form and with his wanting to make spell. And the professor teaching him, and the green slime, and the most beautiful woman in the world. How do you cast that part? And then at the end, you get that wah wah, the rim shot of please send me your free offer, 1F or 2, and scene. I think it'd be a hilariously funny 4-minute cartoon.
That's great.
Not a movie or a TV show, but a brief cartoon.
Hilarious.
In fact, you know what? There's a company now. This hasn't launched yet. It's called Storia.io, Storia, Storia.io. It's a cell phone app. It's supposed to launch this month, but I think it's actually not going to launch until January or February. And what they're doing is they are taking works of short fiction, either reprints or originals written specifically for them, and they're handing them off to animators and turning them into words on a screen with animation behind it.
Huh.
And the idea that they have is that this is maybe going to convince Gen Zers to spend maybe more time reading for pleasure than they're used to, that the animation will sort of suck them in. And Seth, you should absolutely, I'll give you the contact information. You should absolutely send the Last Wizard to Storia, because I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they thought this was perfect for their platform.
Okay.
4-minute animated film.
I'll do it. So I want to thank you again for when I inherited this estate and all these stories, and I've been going through them, and so many stories, I have to read them so quickly, and sometimes they just get lost when I have to read them so quickly to just kind of figure out where they belong, and to go back through them and be able to take my time. I mean, what a joy. And this story was hilarious. So thank you again, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add or bring up before we sign off?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for days, I'm sure. We have a lot of common interests. If this is an opportunity for me to do a little bit of BSP, do you know that abbreviation?
No.
Blatant self-promotion.
Oh, for sure. Please. Yes, do it.
And I'm happy to do a little BSP, and I would steer people who have enjoyed listening to what I have to say, first of all, to have a look at my novel, Dutch Threat, which is available now in ebook and paperback formats, and is going to be out as an audiobook probably within the next month or so. And then I also edit a series of what are called the Inspired By anthologies. It's crime fiction inspired by songs. And this one just came out in October. It's Happiness is a Warm Gun, crime fiction inspired by the songs of the Beatles. This is the 6th or 7th one I've done. I've previously done Joni Mitchell, Jimmy Buffett, Billy Joel, Paul Simon, and also Monkey Business, crime fiction inspired by the films of the Marx Brothers. So I certainly would steer people to any and all of that material.
Well, I will definitely go out and get these, and I'm looking forward to checking them out. So thank you so much. This was an absolute blast.
You're welcome. My pleasure. You're a fun guy to talk to.
Thanks.
A green fungi to talk to.
Green fungi. Let's chat soon. Come visit.
I'd love to.
I
Sounds good.
God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.